Welcome to this afternoon's meeting of the All-Party Parliamentary Group for Special Educational Needs and Disabilities. My name is Olivia Blake and I'm the MP for Sheffield Hallam, and I'm also the chair of the APPG. This is our fourth and final meeting this term as part of our inquiry into the impact of COVID-19 on transitions in education for children and young people with SEND during COVID-19. This meeting will focus on sensory and/or physical difficulties, a broad area of need as defined by the SEND Code of Practice. For the meeting today, we have Sarah, who is our BSL interpreter, and the meeting will be available to watch again, and the video will have captions. There is also live closed captioning available for this meeting. Please click the button at the bottom of the screen to access that. Thank you to everyone who's contributed to our written evidence to our inquiry. We'll be producing a report that will be published early next year, and it will be made public and shared with the Department of Education and the Education Select Committee. A particular thank you for our speakers for joining us today. We will hear from 6 speakers and then MPs will have an opportunity to ask questions. Unfortunately, due to time, attendees will not be able to ask questions. Please tweet around this meeting with hashtag APPGSEND, and you can follow the APPG on Twitter at APPGSEND. So first, we've got some really important speakers. We've got Dina and Holly, who are both deaf young people. So I'm going to ask Dina to speak first, and then Holly, and then we'll take questions for both from MPs. So I'd like to welcome Dina, who is 17 years old and lives in North London. Dina was diagnosed with moderate to severe hearing loss aged 15 and wears hearing aids in both ears. After a year of securing her EHCP, she now attends mainstream independent school in London. She's currently studying her first year of A-levels with the support of a note taker and radio aid in lessons. So over to you, Dina.
So yeah, hi, thank you for introducing me. So my name is Dina. I lost my hearing just before my GCSEs, which I luckily managed to sit and did okay out of them. And I decided to start my A-levels at my then current school. But having not been in an educational setting with hearing loss before, it soon became apparent that it would be very difficult for me to learn. As the only deaf person in my school, and with the very little support that my school could give me, as it was quite a small school, I fell behind, felt quite socially isolated, and my mental health wasn't great. I applied for an EHCP with my family for my hearing loss and my pre-existing processing disorder. And it was a stressful, draining and time-consuming process for both me and my parents. And it felt as if a bunch of strangers were deciding my future based on what they knew about me on a piece of paper. The application process was made a bit more difficult because of COVID, meaning I couldn't attend the meetings that normally would happen, so I had a few that were online. Having no additional support while the application was taking place, I dropped out of school as I was not keeping up. It took probably the best part of a year for the application to come through, and we had to appeal the decision for the band level that they'd given me, as it wasn't substantial enough for me to continue my A-levels. So we appealed the decision and the top band came through, which was lucky. During my time off school, I looked at different schools, including a specialist school for the deaf up in Newbury, but decided on a mainstream independent school local to where I live, which has taught deaf people before. Through my EHCP, I have a note taker who is with me in all my lessons, and I use a self-funded radio aid in all my STEM subjects, which are biology, chemistry and business. Being a new pupil can be challenging at a new school at the best of times, and there are added challenges that deaf people face, especially during the middle of a pandemic, and I just wanted to talk you through a few of those. Socially, it can be quite isolating with the whole masks, because At the moment, my school has rules that in communal places, everyone needs to wear masks, such as in the common room, waiting in line for the queue for lunch, in corridors, on trains, etc. And it can be quite isolating having to try and make new friends while also having the issue with masks, as I'm quite heavily reliant on lip reading. I sometimes describe it to people when someone's wearing a mask in a busy place as trying to understand a fluent French speaker with very limited knowledge of French. There are quite a few misconceptions around deafness as well. My new classmates have asked me, are you really deaf? But you did so well in that test and but you understand what I'm saying, so surely you can't be deaf. Although these are meant with no harsh intentions, they can sometimes be quite offensive to a deaf person. And I don't take them to heart, but I find it quite funny what people ask me. And I say, I'm deaf, not dumb. And apparently my acting skills in pretending to understand group conversations are definitely paying off. It's important to understand that every deaf person is different, but we can do the exact same as hearing people can do, except sometimes a little differently. So I'm learning to drive, so are many of my hearing classmates, which are sometimes surprising to them as they don't realise that deaf people can actually drive. And I go out, I go to parties when it's not COVID. I'm learning to, playing tennis. It's absolutely everything that a normal teenager would do. We just have to have different accommodations. At school, there's also the added challenge of listening fatigue, which I know quite a lot of deaf young people experience. It's basically like having to sit in a classroom, focusing on what the teacher's saying through lip reading, and it can be really, really exhausting. After a long day of lessons, I come home quite tired and have to put in a lot of hard work outside of my lessons, basically just to keep up with my hearing classmates. There's also been the added challenge of online learning, which Holly will talk to you a bit more about, and having to explain my needs to my new teachers, such as reminding them to use the radio aid, to take off their masks, and that takes quite a lot of confidence. It can sometimes be a bit embarrassing as well. At the moment, there's so many deaf children still being taught by teachers wearing masks, and I wanted to ask the MPs why it's taken so long and still hasn't happened, why clear masks have not been accessed in schools. I've had to buy all the clear masks for my teachers. My school has provided some, and some people have not had that. I also wanted to ask why it's such a long process to get an EHCP and why there's very much a lack of support at the same time the application's going through. For me, it meant taking out a year of school. I know that wholeheartedly, without my EHCP, I would still be out of school and would not have the realistic dream of going to uni to study something medical, which is something I've always wanted to do. So thank you for listening, and yeah.
Thank you so much for that contribution, Dina. That was really, really insightful and useful for us. Next, we've got Holly. So I'm going to come to Holly and then we're going to come back with questions for both of you, if that's okay, Dina. So Holly is a 17-year-old who lives in Nottinghamshire in the East Midlands. She has a moderate to severe deafness and goes to a mainstream school. So welcome, Holly.
Hello, so I'm Holly. And I have a moderate to severe deafness that I've had since birth. So unlike Dina, I was always like this. And coronavirus has changed a lot of student plans this year. And online learning, for example, has disadvantaged a lot of young people. But this is especially the case for deaf young people, including myself. I was planning on doing my A-level exams, which will be philosophy, German, business, and EP. But I found that my language grades have actually taken a massive nosedive because of coronavirus, and because I didn't and couldn't have access to a live speaker. And a live speaker is somebody who reads out the listening test, so I have the same chance of getting the higher grades as my able-bodied peers, because I know I can get the higher grades. I used to be targeted A's and B's, but because of coronavirus, I'm now getting E's. And without my live speaker, my ability to get the grade I know I deserve is severely limited. And 7 to 8 months of no face-to-face contact with my teachers has put me in a heavily disadvantaged position. As a result, I've had to do a third year, since I know I will not be able to get into my university of choice, which would be Oxford. Unfortunately, I'm not the only one who's experienced this kind of thing. And a lot of young deaf people have had to radically change their whole plans. And a lot of my friends from YAB, which is the Young Advisory Board, which is for deaf young people, so we help National Deaf Children's Society. We are all, a lot of us that I've spoken to are worried about what this will mean for our future, because we've all had to take a third year. And since there are already misconceptions about people without disability, like Dina said, having to take a third year might cause people to think that we're less intelligent than others, even though all of us just want to be able to access our right to an education.
Thank you so much, Holly. And again, thank you for sharing your experience. I mean, obviously, it's a really difficult time, and those grade differences must be really, really disheartening. I'm going to ask colleagues to come in and ask questions now. What I would ask colleagues is to please state your name before asking your question. This is to benefit our BSL interpreter. So we've got a question from Rachel Hopkins. First.
Hello, I'm Rachel Hopkins. I'm a Member of Parliament for Luton South. Thank you so much for telling us about your experiences, and I always like to learn from young people when I get the chance to talk and listen with you. So my question is, for us, if we could do more of something that makes things better for you, or if we could do less of something or stop something, what are they?
Should I go first?
Yeah, please do.
So I think, sorry, could you ask the question again, please? Sorry.
So what could we do more of to help and make things better, or what should we do less of or stop doing?
I think more support, definitely, or just more awareness in terms of deafness, because like we were both saying, it really is like a misconception about how young deaf people, well, deaf people in general, are quite disadvantaged against, but young deaf people, everyone just thinks we're lazy. So I think maybe if you try to do a campaign or something, or maybe a kind of a presentation or a protest or something about, to show actually that there are young people that have deafness, and that doesn't mean that we don't deserve the right to an education, and maybe try and be more deaf aware in terms of things like that. And I think for less things we can do less than, or things we can do less of, maybe masks, but I think Dina might want to say something about that.
Okay, Dina, do you want to come in?
So I was going to say about definitely more awareness. I've seen on the news actually recently, some people have been wearing clear masks on BBC News. I think if that's something you could do in Parliament, just to raise a little bit more awareness about it, because there's so many misconceptions. Every deaf person's different. I know people who sign, I know people who have cochlear implants and need no support at school. I think something you could do more of is provide a bit more funding. So for me, I had to personally fund my own radio aid, which is quite an expensive piece of equipment. There's sometimes upwards of about £1,000, like for the full equipment, which is a lot to ask. And I know some councils provide them, but if there could be some sort of consistency around that, that would be good. And yeah, there's like 50,000 deaf young people in the UK. If there's just a bit more awareness around it, I think people could benefit from that a lot.
Thank you.
Brilliant, and thank you for those answers. I think, you know, this is something that's been raised with me in medical settings as well. So, you know, either from patients or staff who work in the NHS who have hearing loss. So I think that it's a really important point about these see-through masks, and we should make them more available and make more noise about the fact that they exist. So moving on to the next question, we've got James Daly. That's okay.
Hi, yeah, my name is James Daly. I'm the MP for Bury North in Greater Manchester, and thank you so much for speaking to us today and giving us your experiences. Rachel has sort of asked the question that I wanted to ask, because one of the things when you become involved in politics, one of the things that's always talked about is let's do this strategy, or let's have this plan, or let's have whatever it is. But you're in education now, and you need things to happen now to impact your lives. One of the things that all MPs on this call and throughout Parliament want to ensure that we do put in place policies that even up life chances. So in terms of now, not a campaign, I think you've made brilliant points, but in terms of impacting your education, what could we do now with the proverbial magic wand to make life better for you and others who are struggling with various issues at the moment?
Holly, shall we come to you first?
I think, well, for me personally, live speakers, because obviously I'm a language student, and so my grades have been really impacted. So I think what would really make life easier is just like the listening exam, maybe just getting rid of it. Because even though a lot of people might say that's not really right, I think it would just really help a lot of deaf young people, including myself.
I think right now, especially in the middle of a pandemic, there's one thing that is on everyone's mind is about online learning, the uncertainty of whether tomorrow I might be at home self-isolating and have to do 2 weeks of online school. I think if you put a little bit more emphasis on subtitling, I don't know if there's some sort of thing you could do, message Microsoft to ask them, because I know one MP has already done that. If there's a bit more of an emphasis on it, it might happen quicker. Asking them to default subtitling on all video calls. That would make a massive difference, because there are so many occasions where I've been in lessons and the subtitles have not been on, even though they're very easy solution to have. I think also the clear face masks, just a bit more awareness. Probably if you could provide some more funding for schools that can't provide face masks for students, that would be a big difference as well.
Those are incredibly important points, which I know we'll all take away. So thank you very, very much for that.
Thank you. And we've got one final question for these speakers from Emma Hardy.
Hi everyone, it's Emma Hardy, MP for Hull West and Hessel. Thank you, Holly and Dina, for joining us today. And I can see, Holly, listening to the bell in the background, that you are joining us from schools. So I'm pleased that you've been allowed to make this call. I was going to ask actually about how online learning could be improved, but Dina's kind of answered that question as well. But you mentioned about being sent home in year groups. Would it be better, in your opinion, to improve your online experience, or instead to be prioritised through perhaps a rota system so that you can always stay in school and continue with face-to-face learning? What would be better for you and your learning? Thank you.
I think it depends on the situation. For me personally, I prefer to have a rota, but I think also you maybe have like a balance. So you have a rota, and then for everything else is online learning. So for online learning, I know that, like as Dina said, with subtitles would be really important, but also like BSL interpreters, because I use BSL a little bit, and it helps me kind of understand things that I can't lip read and can't read the subtitles from. That makes sense. And in terms of the rota, I think the rota would be a lot more important as the language student part as well.
I also agree with the rota system. Obviously, every deaf person's different though. There'll be lots of different opinions about it. But in terms of having a rota, there's some sort of consistency, meaning that we'd be able to stay in school. We know when we'd be off. And when you're the only person in a class who's at home self-isolating, the teacher can sometimes forget about you. So forget to turn their online lesson on, or forget to put the subtitles on, or not have their sole focus on you, because there's a whole other class that's actually sitting there. With being in a rota, if all the year group is at home, maybe once a month or whatever it is, there'll be some sort of consistency, and the teacher will be able to properly plan what they're going to do that lesson. Online learning is not easy at all for deaf students, because there's the additional difficulties of like hearing through a screen or the lack of subtitles. but I think if there's some consistency, it will make things a little bit easier.
Thank you both so much.
Brilliant, thank you. I think that is the last question from MPs, and I just want to say a massive thank you to both Holly and Dina for coming along and making time to really offer some very, very useful insight to our inquiry today. Just moving on in the agenda then, I am just struggling. Next speaker we have, and I'm really pleased to welcome, is Sarah White, who's Head of Public Policy and Campaigns at Sense, and then we'll ask some questions of Sarah. So over to you, Sarah White.
Hi everyone, and thank you for having us here today. So just so that you know, Sense is a national disability charity. We support people with complex disabilities, including people who are deaf-blind. And we have a specialist children's service that supports 1,400 families across the country, supporting families of children who have multi-sensory impairments or single sensory impairments and additional needs. So the information that I'm sharing here with you today is based on what we've been hearing coming through from the families who we support over the past few months about their experiences of COVID and the impacts that that's had on transitions. So I think like many children, many of the children who we support haven't been able to attend school for a lot of this year. Obviously at the beginning of the lockdown, that was true for all children. However, as schools have opened up, many of the children and families who we support have not been able to return to school for a number of reasons. And we still have quite a lot of families where children are not attending school. And that's obviously of significant concern to us. For us, as we look at the themes across what's been going on, we are seeing that the inequalities and challenges that families already faced in accessing the education and support that they needed has just been broadened and made more complex during COVID. We've also seen that the system and the resilience of the system has really is really low, so that actually once there are challenges that the system faces, it just fell apart and the support around the families fell apart. And as I've said previously, that hasn't yet really been rebuilt. But also we're really concerned about the longer term impacts that this is having on the children who we support, their siblings and their families. And I just wanted to pick out a few of the kind of main issues that have been coming up for us. I think the first important thing to say is that many of the children we support have additional health and social care needs. And so attending school is a lot more than just education. It's often an opportunity for children to receive treatment and therapies, support from additional experts such as speech and language therapists and other healthcare professionals. So actually not being able to attend school has also impacted on the ability of children and families to access that vital care and support. Whilst some children are now back at school, we're finding that many schools aren't allowing those professionals back in, so many children are still not having access to those therapies. Secondly, what we've seen is that a lot of the guidance that's been issued by the Department for Education and various other government departments has meant that many of the children who we support have been excluded from school. And by that, I mean that they haven't been able to attend. So we saw a phase of time before the summer where there was a process of risk assessing children as to whether they were safer at school or at home. And it was quite clear in the guidance that parents should be involved in that process. However, many of the children who we support were risk assessed and told that they shouldn't be going to school. Families weren't involved in that, and we're really concerned that that has prevented access to education for many children who, had there been some opportunity to discuss and work together, we could have got those children back to school rather than blanket decisions being made about their needs. A third thing that's come up, which actually previous speakers touched on, has been around the accessibility of the home learning that's been made available. A number of our families have commented that actually the materials that were sent home were completely, didn't meet needs at all around access or ability or capacity, which has actually led to a breakdown of trust between parents and schools about whether the education settings are able to meet the needs of their children. And that's something that we really want to see as we go forwards. As many of you know, there were changes to the legislation at the beginning of COVID, and we understand that it was a pandemic, and many of the parents we speak to understand that things had to change rapidly. However, the impacts we've seen around reducing rights around assessments and meeting needs has had an impact on many of the families who we support, who haven't had access to the support that they need, but also has had a huge impact on transition. Many children missed a whole term of school, and for those moving to new schools, new settings, new years, have started the new academic year without an appropriate assessment to identify what care and support and needs they need to have met. So many are starting or haven't actually been able to start in those settings as we've gone back to school because they haven't had those assessments. And finally, just a wider point around the impact this has had on children. Many of the children who we support have additional needs and autism and learning disabilities, and so the change in routine has been really challenging, and many families are reporting that they have seen a real increase in behaviour that challenges in their children, which is just a symptom, I think, of the fact that children have been really struggling and distressed about the changes to their education, which is something I think that we all recognise, but that actually as we move back into school, some of these children need additional support to be able to adapt back into school, and also for staff and people working with them to be able to provide the vital support that they need. So that's just a summary of some of the things that have come up from our families.
Thank you, Sarah. And I think that, you know, it's really important to highlight that additional kind of support that's needed as we move out of lockdown, etc. I'm just going to check if any of my colleagues want to ask any questions, but I'm also just going to quickly say that we did actually write to Mr. Williamson on the impact of face coverings and communication back in September. So I didn't say that, but in response to the first two speakers, that I should have done. I just wanted to let people know that. I'm also really pleased that we've got over 100 people on this call today, so a lot of interest, particularly in this area. One question I would like to ask, if there's no other colleagues who would like to come in, is, you know, we've obviously seen the SEND review postponed, and we're not entirely sure when we're going to see it. Do you think that that review needs to reflect some of the issues that have come out of COVID, or do you think that, you know, if it's too historic almost, it won't capture these new issues that are emerging?
I think many of the issues are the same. They've just been exacerbated by COVID. So I think pre-COVID, we would have said that we wanted the SEND review to focus on or include ways to ensure that people with the most complex needs are having those needs met, but also looking at SEND support and other elements of the system. I think we would still be saying that now, but I think we do need to recognise that there needs to probably be additional consideration around the longer term impacts of COVID, particularly around transition, and I think also around the gaps in learning and education that many of these children have had. And I think particularly the things we really want to see is much better joint working across health and social care and education, because actually this is a really important thing to get right for our families, and to work across the local area with local authorities, with schools. And I think that's something we really want to see got right in the SEND review. And
can I also ask what funding you'd like to see coming to local areas to help, particularly in communication support? Because I think, you know, a lot of us recognise that a lot of this support has disappeared or has been suspended during this. And do you think that there's money, where should money be directed most, do you think?
Yeah, I think obviously more funding in the system is obviously something that we're going to call for. I think we know that capacity is really stretched, and that there are specialists out there who are working across many local authorities and many different schools. So I think increasing resource and capacity in specialist support would be really key. And I think also supporting upskilling staff to be able to meet needs remotely and working in different ways. I think we have seen that online support can work in a blended approach, but that it needs resourcing, and that it's just not something we can leave and just do in mainstream settings, but that we need to build in for all children, I think.
Okay, brilliant. I've got a question coming in from Emma Hardy, so over to Emma.
Hi, thank you, Sarah. Couple of questions. One of them is around, there's been a lot of call for obviously laptops being provided by the Department for Health. Has there also been any specific requests made to the department for accessible technology to support students who are working online as well? And there's been quite a lot of studies done on the disadvantage attainment gap and how that's widened during the COVID pandemic. Have there been any particular studies done on the impact of students with SEND and how and the disadvantage gap during the pandemic as well? So I've squeezed in 2 questions. Thanks, Olivia.
So on the technology issue, that's something that we raise quite regularly, is around technology solutions being inclusive and considering the wide range of needs that people have. Laptops are fantastic on the one hand, however, that needs to include accessible software and additional access needs that people may have. And I think also it's around ensuring that we're looking at, I mean, I talked about a lot of the children we support have equipment that they use at school, and for a number of months weren't able to access that at home. So I think it's also about a lot of that equipment is there, but making it sure it's being used in the right way to enable children to access education. On the point around education attainment, that isn't something that we've particularly looked into as yet, but if we find anything, I'm happy to forward that on to you. It's not something we've been looking at specifically, but I'm sure there will be. There's a lot of research going on out there at the moment, and we will be looking at that ourselves going forwards for sure.
Thank you, Emma, and thank you, Sarah, for those answers. I'm going to move on if that is okay. So just want to say well done for your contribution today and the work that Sense have been doing through this. And welcome to Poppy Rose, who is a parent and co-founder of the SEND National Crisis. So welcome, Poppy.
Hi there. Yeah, I'm Poppy Rose, and I've got a 16-year-old son who's diagnosed with special educational needs and disabilities. He's got multiple diagnoses. I'm also co-founder of SEND National Crisis. We're a parent-led group campaigning for funding, support and the rights of disabled and children with special educational needs. We organised a protest last year or the year before that was across 29 regions. We're also in collaboration with Special Needs Jungle, SOS SEN and Send Action as part of Send Community Alliance. So we're a voluntary parent-led organisation. I'm going to talk about sensory issues today. The Send Code of Practice expands over 4 broad areas: special educational needs and support, and that involves communication and interaction, cognition and learning, social, emotional and mental health, and then the seriously overlooked, often forgotten area of sensory and physical needs. It's recorded that 1 in 5 children have sensory difficulties that make it hard to learn and function within school. I would say that that number is actually a lot higher, and a large proportion of SEND children will have a degree of sensory issues. SPD, sensory processing disorder, affects a child's auditory, visual and motor skills. It affects the ability to process and sequence information. Sensory process disorder is classed as an umbrella term covering a variety of neurological disabilities, but yet still to date is not recognised or identified as a qualifying disability, making that child eligible for special education, support and related services. Children that experience sensory issues will most likely struggle with following instructions, interacting with others and regulating their emotions. They may have problems with expressive language, organisation skills, and memorising information. These are obviously important skills to learn at school. Most will have delayed fine and gross motor skills. These children are quite often misinterpreted as badly behaved, lazy, clumsy, disruptive, emotional and uncooperative even, when in fact an out-of-sync child performing ordinary tasks and responding to everyday events is enormously challenging. To help that child, we should be looking at the activities, environments and the individuals around them. For many, it takes just small adjustments such as movement breaks, reducing demands, sensory diets, relaxing of policies, and that could make a huge difference to how that child can manage. I believe training and support around SPT is seriously lacking at the moment, especially within the mainstream sector. And families are then forced to seek specialist provision for smaller classes, specialist provision, therapies that's just not accessed within mainstream. And whilst we welcome the £300 million being given to expand the specialist sector, we run the risk of returning to poor quality segregation. Segregation is not inclusion. There is little evidence to suggest that local families have been consulted over the new special schools. We need to see signs of investment in improving provision beyond capital expansion. Spend more money on training and supporting staff. There needs to be sustained pressure to improve inclusion, a change in infrastructure, accessibility, provision and attitude. But most importantly, accountability, because until there is any, our children will continue to be discriminated. That's it.
Brilliant. I mean, thank you, Poppy, for raising some really incredibly pertinent points there. I'm just going to ask any colleagues if they have any questions to put in the chat. And if not, I'm going to take chair's privilege and ask you a question. It would be great to get an understanding, because I think that a lot of us are concerned about the issues of, segregation of children. But do you think that COVID-19 might push more parents to look for provision that isn't mainstream because of their experiences?
What Sarah touched upon, I would agree with completely, in the fact that this has just been exacerbated really with COVID. These are challenges that families faced long before COVID came along. And it could mean that families will be pushing more towards specialist provision, as at the moment the support within mainstream isn't there. It isn't there at all. My son was out of school. He was in a mainstream school, and he then was out of school for a year before we managed to secure a specialist placement. And to be honest, a lot of his needs could be met within a mainstream environment. The transition from primary school to secondary school is vast, it's massive. And it just takes a little bit of sort of early intervention. And if families are not getting that within a mainstream environment, they will be forced to go to a specialist.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that answer, Poppy. I think that's very, very true. Obviously, these issues are long-standing, and part of the reason we exist as a all-party parliamentary group is to try and get change on these issues. I don't see anyone else indicating for you, but can I just say a massive thank you, Poppy, for taking the time to come and talk to us as a parent and as co-founder of the SEND National Crisis. We recognise the amazing work that you're doing to raise parents' voice in this space. Moving on then, we've got our next speaker. We've got so many speakers today, it's fantastic. And I'm really pleased to welcome Simone Ehcps, who's Policy and Campaigns Coordinator for the Alliance for Inclusive Education, also known as ALFI. So welcome, Simone, and over to you. Simone, are you there? Great.
Okay. Are we there? Okay, thank you for inviting ALFI to the SEND APPG to provide all evidence into the SEND inquiry. Our starting position always begins with the UNCRPD, UN Convention, Rights of Persons with Disabilities, Article 24. Is disabled people's rights to inclusive education being upheld by the government? ALFI decided to focus on a couple of issues, i.e. remote education, that wouldn't just have a short-term but a longer-term impact upon disabled people's access to mainstream education post-COVID-19. ALFI had conducted a survey over the first lockdown to find out what disabled people's experiences were around remote education, and we're now conducting a second one post during stage 2 of lockdown. So what do we find? We found that 83% of parents were expected to home educate their disabled children. 54% of parents had not been received any support from either the school or the local authority to help with school education. 34% of parents had received some but not all sufficient support that help with home education of disabled children. And when we talk about that, we don't just mean talking about remote education, but alternative education, concrete education that disabled children, particularly a lot of those with significant learning difficulties, might experience in an educational setting in person. So what are the main issues that we found? We found there were 4 main issues in regards to remote education. First of all was around adapted and assisted technology. Was the technology provided, did disabled people have the technology that enabled them to be able to access the mainstream education from home, including assisted technology? A lot of the disabled students had the technology in the school environment and were able to access the curriculum. However, when they were at home, they may not have had that opportunity. The parents we spoke to had the equipment there at home to assist their children at home. However, some teachers told us because parents couldn't afford the technology, a lot of the kids had to do without any education. Second of all, accessibility of virtual platforms and accessibility and differentiation of the curriculum. At the beginning, we were told that there were several platforms, i.e., Oak Academy School and other and BBC, that provided online learning opportunities, but had no consideration for the inclusion of disabled pupils and students, i.e., as Holly and Dinesh had explained already, around BSL interpretation, capturing, and also for children with visual impairments, visual descriptions of what was being taught. In-person support, AT, and therapy, very, very important, given that for a lot of disabled students, simply just being educated at home with a device wouldn't be sufficient. A lot of the kids need support in terms of around differentiation of the curriculum, around support in terms of structuring their learning, and also access to occupational and speech therapy. There was absolutely non-existence of this support provided for students, even via online platforms. And last but not least, local authority support duties finally, the local authorities' duties around the care around the Children and Families Act easements, regards to having best endeavours to secure mainstream provision. So what did our survey found? So some of the examples that were given to us were as follows. Some of the experiences that parents had were that told us there are virtual learning environments, Blackboard, but the content isn't accessible 90% of the time. Curriculum content and learning platforms haven't been changed except more material has been provided. This is what one disabled student told us. Another parent said, the challenge for us is accessing online resources. Lots of content isn't captured and there is very little in BSL. Tried using BSL bite size today and had the same problem with clips not being captured, which is frustrating. Braille materials have been provided for key subjects for my oldest child. All through this may be withdrawn due to staff deployment. Currently had no contact regarding my youngest child. The last parent said, I have to sit with him the whole time he is learning to keep him on track. rather than Google Classroom, some kind of FaceTime with a learning support assistant or teacher would have been helpful. We need proper support to teach new concepts. So it's quite clear it was very clear that disabled people were very disadvantaged as a result of remote education. What did we discover? We discovered that there is currently no clear legal framework setting out who is responsible for accessibility of online learning platforms, curriculum and delivery, in-person support, and the like under the Equality Act 2010, public sector bodies, website, mobile applications, accessibility regulations, UNCRPD Article 24 or the Human Rights Act. Clearly, there is still a lack of clarity in the Coronavirus Act 2020 provision of remote education temporary continuing direction. This is the direction that's just been issued to schools, requiring them to provide remote education for children affected by COVID-19. The Children and Families Act easements have been a disaster for disabled pupils and students, leaving them without any provision whatsoever for many months. This is just unacceptable, inhumane and unjust. From our research, there is plenty of evidence of this government continuing to violate disabled people's UNCRPD Article 24 rights as a result of the Coronavirus Act provisions. We have managed to secure a debate organised by Lisa Cameron, the Disability APPG, on accessibility and access to inclusive education for disabled students on December the 9th, and we would welcome MPs to attend that debate. So what do we want in the future? What this clearly illustrates is we can't continue with the existing broken SEND framework. It is now time to take a big fresh look about what we need to look for in the future. We need transformation as opposed to tinkering. Second, we need to ask ourselves, what is the purpose of our education system? Given that what COVID-19 has brought about is that there is no longer going to be jobs for life. There are questions about increasing inequalities between different groups of people, increasing fragmentation that is happening within our society. It is now time for us to consider what is the purpose of our education system. Finally, we want the government to start implementing the UNCRPD Monitoring Committee's observations and recommendations around the UNCRPD Article 24. We need the government to work with disabled people and their organisations to develop a fully inclusive education system with the ultimate goal of ending segregation within our education system. That way, we would be able to have an inclusive education that's fit for purpose during any future pandemics and post-COVID-19.
Thank you, Simone. You asked a lot of questions in that and answered them really, and I think that the research that you've done over this period has really highlighted some of the key issues. I'm just going to ask colleagues if anyone has a question for Simone, and if not, I'm going to just ask, what one thing do you think would make the biggest difference off the back of our report that we're building?
I think absolutely seeing disabled people's access to inclusive education as a fundamental human right. Unless we absolutely agree, the starting point is this is a disabled people's human rights, and that there is no room for segregated education, in our education system.
Very inspirational ask there, I think it's fair to say. So moving onwards, we've got our final speaker, and I'm really pleased to welcome Councillor Teresa Heritage, who's the Children's and Young People's Board member from the Local Government Association. So thank you for joining us, Teresa, and if Councillor Heritage even, please could you welcome to you, and over to you.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Thank you today for also for inviting me to this event. So I'm very pleased to say, Chair, that I work with your mother on the Children and Young People's Board, so I was quite interested to hear that. So I am County Councillor Teresa Heritage. I'm Vice Chair of the LGA's Children and Young People Board, Deputy Leader of Hertfordshire County Council, and also Executive Member for Children and Young People and Families in Hertfordshire, of course. Providing support for children and young people with SEND is one of the most challenging parts of for a council. Since the Children and Young Families Act in 2014, the demand for educational health and care plans, EHCPs, has increased year on year, with an increase of 10% in the last year alone. That's nationally. In Hertfordshire, the number of EHCPs has increased by 72% since 2014 and 22% since September 2019 alone. Even more pressure has been placed on councils' SEND teams to support children and young people due to COVID. This has included contact with parents and families, the creation of new and extension of existing services, and the redesign of many delivery models. This is in addition to coordinating risk assessments, making home arrangements for the most vulnerable, and fielding increased parental inquiries. The LGA is concerned that many children with SEND, whose needs have not been entirely met while they've been away from school, will require additional support to help them to adjust in the classroom. For example, additional help from educational psychologists, and this will place additional requirements on already stretched high needs budgets. During the first spike, many children also missed out on therapies such as speech and language, so their physical development has also been badly hit. We are anticipating a sharp increase in demand on everything from universal support services through to urgent child protection responses as children return to school and the impact of the pandemic becomes apparent. There are ways the government can work with councils and schools to ensure children with SEND get the support they need during and beyond the current crisis. The LGA welcomed the review into support for children with special educational needs and disabilities that was announced by the government in September last year. The LGA has called for review to ensure all schools have sufficient funding to meet the needs of children and young people with SEND in their areas, create a clear accountability framework for SEND in local areas, restore flexibility to councils to move money between blocks of dedicated schools grant, empower Ofsted to use levels of mainstream inclusion when grading schools on their performance, and to enable councils to build new special schools where they are needed. To support all of this work, the LGA is calling on the government to fund the development of a sector-led improvement programme to help councils, health and schools learn from the best performing areas to provide more effective SEND support to children and young people that need it. However, we are concerned with the rumours that the review may not report until July 2021. And we welcomed your letter last month calling on the Secretary of State to act as soon as possible. The SEND system is under significant pressure, and it is vital that reforms to the system are urgently brought forward to help councils and their partners to better support children and young people with SEND. Whilst we welcome the review, there are issues that must be dealt with urgently, including securing high needs funding. You will all be aware of the funding pressures facing schools. The recent Education Policy Institute on the state of school finances in local authority and academy schools in England found that almost a third of local authority maintained schools are in deficit. If councils do not receive enough funding to cover the high cost of SEND, they will not have the resources to allocate extra funding to highly inclusive schools that take higher than average numbers of pupils with additional needs. While it was welcome to hear that the government would increase the school's budget by 7.1 billion by 2022-23, they must urgently confirm council high needs blocks for 21-22 and used the ongoing review of SEND to give councils the powers and long-term certainty of funding to support children and young people. And urgently, we're calling for the review for distribution based on a leads need rather than historical spend. By way of example, despite the additional funding announced in July 2020, Hertfordshire is now forecasting a high needs deficit of £11 million in 22-23 and 19.8 million in 23-24. Secondly, the average annual cost to a council of a special needs placement in 2017-18 was £6,000 per pupil per year in a mainstream school. This is much more cost effective compared with the £23,000 required to fund an individual child per year in maintained special schools and £40,000 per pupil at an independent or non-maintained special school. Furthermore, it is also beneficial to a child's well-being due to the likelihood that the mainstream school is closer to their home by cutting travel and enabling them to be with their local peers despite their disabilities. We are therefore calling on the government to introduce a system of incentives and rewards that enable mainstream schools to better cater for the needs of children with SEND. And my final point relates to the cost of homeschool transport, which is hitting councils' already overstretched budgets. LGA research found a 6.5% increase in the total national spend on home to school transport between 14-15 and 17-18. The percentage of councils that are overspending in their home to school transport budgets have consequently increased from 71% to 83%. The total national deficit on home to school transport now stands at £111 million. While schools have worked hard to reduce demand for mainstream home to school transport, the picture for SEND is very different. Our research found that there has been a significant rise in both the numbers of children in receipt of transport and the associated costs for providing that transport year on year. Home to school transport for SEND now accounts for 69% of councils' overall home to school costs, transport costs. So to finalise, thank you all for you on this APPG group to highlighting the pressures of the system. The LGA continues to work on a cross-party basis to ensure that the government gives councils the necessary tools, powers and resources required to deliver support that children with SEND and their families need. Once again, thank you for the invitation and happy to take any questions. And I also have a colleague from the LGA that can help me with any difficult ones that you might put to me. So thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thank you, Councillor Teresa Heritage, for that. I think that it's really useful to get the kind of insight from local authorities, because I think the sector as a whole for a long time has been calling for extra funding for high needs, but obviously that's even more of an issue as COVID rolls out as well. I'm just going to see if any colleagues have any questions. I can't see any, but I think that one question that keeps on coming up is around how effective you feel the emergency funding that's gone to councils has been able to be directed to helping in spend in these areas, or do you think that the government needs to do more in grants and things like that to support local authorities?
Yeah, no, I understand. Well, actually, the funding has been very useful for Hertfordshire, and especially in the SEND department, as it were. So we've actually been able to use that COVID funding to bring on more officers in to help with the backlog of EHCPs, especially with the annual reviews. That's where we'll be really challenged. The big challenge around EHCPs is, of course, that the policy was instituted, but then no funding came with it. So councils have had to fund fund it, but also deal with the escalation. And with the shortage of school places around special needs, for those young people who can't go into mainstream schools, for instance, and I heard today lots of those young people with sensory disabilities, but our biggest challenge is around special emotional health needs. That's the real big area. Those higher, those higher need areas. So we are behind in Hertfordshire. Not behind, our annual assessments are behind, but we're hoping with the COVID additional funding to pick up on that. And we've also been able to put out support where the schools have requested it. So it's worked for us.
And just one question from me, where the LGA has come across good practice, would you be willing to share that with us? I think you already do a great job of that, but it would be very useful for us to see good examples from this period.
Yeah, I mean the LGA, everything we do is shared. We have improvement groups around the country. It's regional. I lead on the Eastern region, so absolutely no problem at all. We're always happy to share anything we have.
Brilliant. Okay, thank you. I don't think that any of my colleagues have any questions, and I think a few of them have had to nip off because we've gone over a little bit. So thank you so much for your engagement and all our speakers today for taking part in our meeting. I think it's been a really good session. Just a reminder to contact your local MPs with any individual difficulties you may be experiencing with the SEND system. As an APPG, we cannot help with individual casework. The next APPG will be our AGM in late February or early March, where we will also publish the report from this inquiry. We will announce the date of this meeting on Twitter and via the mailing list and on our website, which is www.naht.org.uk/APPG SEND. Once again, please follow us on Twitter at APPG_SEND. And a reminder today that today's meeting will be available to rewatch with video and captions, hopefully as soon as we can get that up online. Finally, once again, a massive thank you to all our speakers, and we're pleased to have been able to give you a platform to speak directly to us as MPs. Thank you for all the MPs for taking part in today's meeting, and we hope to welcome you to future meetings of the APPG, all those that have attended today. So wish you all the very best and a happy Christmas, I think I can say at this point now, and hope to see you all in the new year at our next meeting. And I just think it's fantastic that we've had over 100 people on this call today. So once again, thank you for your time and efforts. Bye bye, everyone.